Greetings everyone, this is Nolan here today, and I'm going to be doing a live reaction video. The video that we will be watching today, that we'll be covering, is going to be a short clip on Charlie Kirk's channel. It's called, Can You Be a Christian and a Nationalist? And if you're familiar with the channel, you can probably guess why I would want to cover this video. Roughly about 8 months ago, I made a video which the intention behind it was to expose people to what the early Christians, pretty much as far as Christianity had spread within the first 300 years, what every Christian believed about a Christian's role, or really we could say the relationship with the government. And frankly, I have been so excited to make this video all day today. I've been waiting to record this ever since earlier today this clip was sent to me. It was recommended to me by someone, and it's just an amazing clip. Charlie Kirk is completely blindsided. If you don't know who Charlie Kirk is, you probably do. I would expect everybody to know who Charlie Kirk is, but just to get this out of the way, Charlie Kirk is, obviously he's on the right. He is a Republican, very pro-Trump from what I remember, and would identify himself as a conservative Christian. He would say that a Christian can both be a Christian and then also a nationalist. And in this very clip, a young man at the university approaches Charlie Kirk with pretty much the same position that we hold. And of course, as I tried to expose in the video that I made 8 months ago, not only the position that we hold, but the position that we've inherited from the earliest Christians, the historical apostolic faith. And so it's just fascinating to watch this. The kid, the young guy, his name is Nick. I think he did a really good job, honestly, for being a young guy not used to this kind of debate style live like this, where everything is very quick-paced and a lot of back and forth. Charlie cuts him off quite a bit, but that's okay. You know, you got to keep everybody moving. I understand why he does that, but it's just very interesting to watch. Charlie himself, we'll see this here, he admits at the very end of the video, he says, "This is a new one." And it's just so fascinating to see a completely alien concept being introduced to these guys live. You're seeing it for the very first time, them being introduced to the early Christian faith, the apostolic faith, the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. I just want to say, though, about Nick's performance again. I think he did very well. Now, obviously, while I'm going to talk about this video, I'm going to talk about various things that Nick could have done better and things that he could have said better. But, you know, I mean, I don't know how well I would have fared, to be completely honest with you, whenever we're talking about doing something live here. So with everything being factored in, that him not being very used to this, probably pretty new to this idea, I don't know how he discovered, you know, what the early Christians believed, if he just read it for himself or if it was someone on YouTube, maybe perhaps our video, I'm not sure. But I would have to assume that this is probably pretty new to him, and I think he did a pretty well, you know, a pretty decent job whenever you consider everything, representing the early Christian belief. That being said, there were areas where he could have done better, but like I already said, I think that this is to be expected. Charlie Kirk is used to doing this all the time. Somebody that's used to this kind of debate environment, they're very well versed in it. Even if their arguments aren't so good necessarily, they know how to control the conversation and move things along. And I don't know if Charlie, throughout this conversation, intentionally misdirects the conversation away from what this young guy, Nick, is, you know, trying to debate, trying to discuss. I don't know if Charlie is moving away from that and going off in a different direction because it's advantageous in the argument to disorient the person that he's talking to, or if it's just because, I think this is also possible, frankly, that he's just so blindsided by this completely new to him, I must stress, belief, this new doctrine. You have to understand, most people are not familiar with this, especially in America. This is totally alien to them. This is completely against everything that they've been raised in, what they know, and so they're not even going to have any, like, arguments in store. Charlie Kirk kind of operates on, you know, kind of like rehashing the same talking points a little bit. He's used to discussing specific subject matter, but whenever you're completely blindsided by something so alien, I don't know if he's just trying to steer the conversation away from unfamiliar territory to territory that's familiar with him, or if he's just intentionally leading people into a trail of confusion. I don't know which. Maybe it's a combination, but either way, that happens throughout this. And I just want to give a little video here, a short explanation, a response. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this started.
Hello, how are you?
Good. My name is Nick. I'm an aerospace engineering student here. Got a couple questions.
Awesome.
That's all right. So I'm particularly concerned about your brand of Christianity. As a Christian myself, Christian nationalism I do not agree with at all. I think it's antithetical to the values of the early church. And I think, how do you reconcile especially white Christians in this America, marrying politics and power with their faith in this country?
Well, there's a lot there. I've never described myself as a Christian nationalist. So I'm a Christian and a nationalist, so I've never used those two.
And then right there, that and nationalist, where in the scriptures does a Christian...
Well, thank you.
So just to interrupt real quick here, again, like I was saying a moment ago, Charlie's, I think, trying to like redirect it back to familiar territory. I expect that he's very much a fish out of water in this scenario because he's not used to having this kind of conversation. He has nothing in his database stored up in response to this. You know, this isn't in his arsenal, his repertoire. And so I don't know if it's just the fear of interacting and engaging with something completely alien that he does this, you know, the comfort of returning to something that's familiar, or if his brain just can't even, it's just so fringe at this point. It's such a minor, you know, only the smallest minority of people believe this anymore, that he's not even like, you know, picking up anything that's being said maybe. I'm not sure. But you see how Nick here, this young student, he's not concerned with Christian nationalism. You know, Charlie's of the sort of worldview, the way that he understands things, is that you can be a Christian and a nationalist, but there's a separate group of people that are Christian nationalists. I would imagine that he's got probably somebody like Nick Fuentes in mind, somebody like more far right, maybe. The point is, there's a distinction in his mind, and you know, I would concede that distinction technically exists, but that's not what Nick is concerned with, and that's what I mean here. The problem is that Charlie doesn't even really understand what Nick is trying to communicate to him. I guess just because it's just so foreign.
Jeremiah 29:7, demand the welfare of the nation that you are in, because your welfare is tied to your nation's welfare. Let me continue. Daniel fasted and prayed for his nation. Esther and Mordecai cared for their nation. They were counsel to the king.
Right.
Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Joseph, Jacob. I could keep on going. Moses, Aaron. In fact, Moses was so political that he wrote an entire book of the Torah all about how to set up a government. It's the book of Deuteronomy. So, in fact, the Bible is an explicitly political text amongst many other things.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and interrupt here again. You know, if only the early Christians knew about the book of Deuteronomy, maybe it would have helped them, right? I mean, I'm being facetious here, obviously. This is such a stupid argument. And, of course, if you've seen the video that I made, what the early Christians believed about politics, or, you know, why early Christians rejected politics, as I titled it, you know that right out the gate, one of the very first things that I discussed in the video was the Old Testament, because it's such an obvious knee-jerk reaction from these people. No doubt, you know, trying to appeal to antiquity. You notice, by the way, just to make a small point, people will oftentimes first go to antiquity. They try to go back in time with their belief being very ancient. And of course, that's what Nick is doing also, and what we do as well. Anytime we want to prove what we believe, we go back to the early church, for example, in this case. You know, this channel is concerned with Ante-Nicene Christians. That's why the channel is titled what it's titled. So the reason that Charlie starts right off the bat with the Old Testament, I would have to assume, is him trying to appeal to antiquity. And I completely understand that. But it is a dishonest argument, because even within the Old Testament, but even if we confine ourselves strictly to the Old Testament, Charlie Kirk's idea here doesn't hold up. This is a misrepresentation in a lot of ways of what the Old Testament is communicating to people about, kings and government authorities, you understand that Israel went a very long time without a king, which I talked about. The only reason that Israel ended up with a king is because of the fact that they were asking for it. They wanted to be like the rest of the world that had kings. God didn't originally want to set up a human king among Israel. He just wanted to be king. But to be honest, even if we put aside the fact that Israel wasn't originally supposed to have a king in that sense, but God was supposed to be their king, I imagine that I would say in response to Charlie Kirk after this, I agree with everything that you just said. All of that is true. And yet what I'm saying is also true. Would you like to hear the harmony? Because as I facetiously teased a moment ago, the early Christians were already familiar with everything that Charlie Kirk is bringing up. In fact, I would say that they were more familiar than Charlie Kirk is with the scriptures. These people had much of scripture memorized. Charlie Kirk would then say, well, they're wrong. Well, even if you think that they're wrong, you have to acknowledge that they probably were familiar with everything that you're bringing up. And there might be a rebuttal to everything that you're saying, a harmony.
Now, can we interpret those texts in the light of the revelation of Christ? Because you just cited all Old Testament texts, but you've not once cited St. Paul.
Okay, yeah. If you want me to also...
So again, I think Nick is doing a very tremendous job, all things considered. However, the most effective thing that you can do whenever you're speaking to someone like Charlie here is to concede to everything that they're saying insofar as, all of those things happen in the Old Testament, and I also agree with it, and I still believe everything that I just said. Would you like to hear me explain why that is, how that's possible? So we shouldn't be afraid of sparring in the Old Testament. However, I do completely understand that Nick is wanting to redirect the conversation away from personal interpretation of the Old Testament, which is what Charlie Kirk is doing, and he's suggesting that we should be looking at the Old Testament not through our own newly invented sort of way, but instead that we should be filtering the Old Testament through the revelation of Christ, which is to say that Christ is the, literally, revelation, which is literally to say that Christ reveals the actual meaning of the Old Testament. We read throughout the New Testament again and again, Christ saying, and also the apostles saying, that the Jews are blind to the truth of the Old Testament and the prophets, and that a veil lies over the Old Testament for them. And every time that they read it, they do not truly see it for what it is, because that veil, literally veil, is completely obscuring it. It's hiding it. And because of that, the Jews are completely clueless as to what the Old Testament is really talking about. But Paul says that the veil is removed in Christ. And that's literally what revelation means here. That's, I believe, what Nick is trying to get at with Charlie Kirk here, is that, okay, you're going at it from your own personal interpretation of the Old Testament. Let's redirect things here to understanding it the way that Christ revealed it. And obviously, I think that any Christian would first and foremost be concerned with the commands and precepts of Christ and the apostles. And again, I really have to wonder if Nick maybe has watched, I don't know, if maybe he's watched David Berceau's stuff, or if maybe he did watch the politics video that we did. There's a lot of interesting language being used here, the things that he's choosing to emphasize, and as he chooses to emphasize later on in the video. I like that he's wanting to bring up the kingdom of heaven. He's wanting to establish the kingdom of heaven with Charlie. I did that very early on in the video because that's a very important thing to discuss and establish very early on in this kind of a conversation.
Just so we're clear, do you think that the New Testament is greater than the Old Testament?
It is. It is greater because the revelation of Christ dictates how we interpret the Old Testament.
So you think that all of a sudden, like Genesis 1 is not as great just because of the New Testament?
The Old Testament was a type and shadow of the things to come, and now we live in the full revelation of Christ.
Let's see again here. Charlie is moving away from what Nick is actually wanting to discuss. Now, Nick does say that the New Testament is greater, and I think that anyone would concede that. The New Covenant is superior to the Old Covenant. Christ is the the superior version of Moses. We have two lawgivers in the faith. We have Moses and we have Christ. And I can tell you, even Moses would say that Christ is superior to him. But Charlie is now wanting to make this a debate over whether or not Genesis is somehow like less inspired than, the Gospel of Matthew. It has nothing to do with something being less inspired. It just has to do with, I think, what Nick is trying to get at here, that Christ is the top authority. And the way that we're viewing the Old Testament should be through the lens that he has established.
That is by definition
such
lesser.
A dangerous theological...
That's not true. That's Christological theology.
Hold on. Of course I believe in the resurrection. But to all of a sudden say that, like, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is, like, somehow lesser because of the revelation of the New Testament. Christ even said, I did not come to abolish the law of the prophets. I came to fulfill the law. In fact, he said...
Yeah, okay. As we talk about in the video, what does fulfill mean? There's a lot of silliness around this word today. It's like taking on its own new meaning. But when we first initially translated that into English, fulfill had a very basic definition. And whenever you hear it, you're going to laugh at how simple it is. It literally means to fill full, as in Moses filled up a glass half full. Jesus then came along and filled it up to the brim, to the very top. And the true Jesus, our Jesus, Jesus the Christ, he's the one that truly completed Moses' work in the most substantial way possible. He did fulfill the law and the prophets, both by doing the things that they predicted about him, but also morally speaking too. I mean, if Charlie's read the New Testament, right after Jesus says this about fulfilling the law and the prophets and not abolishing them, he then says, like right afterwards, he says, you guys have heard that you should only exact the same measure of violence that was done to you back to that person. It should be completely reciprocal. An eye for an eye. And then he says, but I'm telling you, if a man punches you on one side of the face, you offer him the other side of the face. And the key difference here is between outright just contradicting and abolishing what came before. And so then someone will ask, what are we then? Are we playing word games here with what Jesus is saying? Are we saying, no, he didn't abolish it, but he actually did? No, there's no kind of word games going on here. The fundamental difference just comes down to outright contradicting what preceded us versus fulfilling it, bringing it to its logical conclusion. Are you walking backwards or forwards? That's the difference between abolishing and fulfilling. Walking backwards, walking forwards. And Jesus was walking forwards. He was advancing the law, as all of the early Christians say.
However, to use a New Testament example, as you asked, says in 1 Timothy, pray for your leaders in authority by name that they might make righteous great decisions.
And I could probably assume that Nick is getting a little bit aggravated by Charlie here. Not that I could blame him. Charlie is a moron. But that being said, I think that Nick could have done a little bit better in his response here, rather than nodding his head in kind of like a flippant way, a disagreeable kind of way. The right thing to respond with here is, I agree with that. The early Christians agreed with that. The early Christians probably did that more than you did, Charlie. Do you do that, Charlie? Did you pray for Biden, Charlie? Now, Charlie, do you only pray for Republicans, or do you also pray for the Democrats? You understand that when the apostle said that, he was under what emperor? Nero. And look, if you thought Biden was bad, you have no idea how bad Nero was. Nero was a disaster. Nero was a freak show, okay? Now, you know what? Let's go ahead and do just a quick comparison between Biden and Nero, just so you understand. Biden was elected by this country. And someone may contest the results of the election. And look, I completely get that, and I sympathize with you. But even then, even if you believe the election was rigged, you have to admit that a sizable amount of the population of this country elected him. They voted on him. People voted on him. At least more than one person voted for Biden. Okay, we turn to Nero. Nobody voted for Nero. Let's go back to Biden. Biden jailed political protesters, right? And frankly, I would concede that a lot of those people didn't deserve it. Let's go ahead and shift our focus back to Nero. Nero didn't merely jail, imprison political protesters. Nero was responsible, at least according to tradition, for the execution of the most beloved apostles, Peter and Paul. And then thirdly, Biden was, yes, pretty sick in regard to a lot of his social beliefs with regard to various sexual perversions, for example. Nero, on the other hand, murdered his wife, his pregnant wife, kicked her to death, and then, after feeling bad about it, as one does, he thought that he'd make up for it by finding a young boy who he thought resembled his wife in some ways, and basically made him a tranny in modern lingo, okay? This is a guy that killed his wife, had like a transgender fake wife, killed the apostles, and like wasn't even elected. And we're supposed to pray for this guy, according to Paul. And before anyone asks, I do pray for the political rulers. I pray for peace. And all of the early Christians did that as well, no matter how bad the emperor was. So if I were there, I would concede to Charlie. I would say, yeah, that's true. Guess what's also true? Christians cannot be nationalists.
Christ our Lord said, on this rock build my what?
Church.
Wrong. Ecclesia. It's not the word church.
Okay,
the word
English
church,
translations of Common Bible say church, so my bad.
well, actually, it shouldn't, because the original Greek term says, on this rock build my government structure. Ecclesia was a secular word used in that time.
What a putz. I mean, really. I mean, we're totally going off into the weeds here. It's completely illogical what Charlie is doing here. He's leading the audience off into his own confusion, his own rabbit trail, and it just completely ruins the conversation here. Don't you see, just from this brief example, the importance of going through Christian doctrine in an orderly way, presenting things in an orderly way? It's important the way that you present things, because you'll just be all over the place. And if you let a person like this, a wild person like Charlie Kirk, a total crazy person like Charlie Kirk, he will just lead you down all sorts of twisted paths. This isn't even worth engaging. And I'm only going to take a brief second for this because, like, again, frankly, this is just a complete waste of time, this tangent here. But just to address this stupid thing that Charlie has said, ecclesia can be, and you can objectively verify this, ecclesia can be translated a few different ways. It can be translated as assembly. It can be translated as a cultivation, a group of people, a body of people, a summoned body of people, for example. It can refer to citizens even. But even putting that stupid tangent that he went on off to the side, I will concede, as any reasonable Christian would, that Christ did create a government. There is a church government, Charlie. It's not the freaking United States, though. Okay? If he wanted to create the United States, maybe he wouldn't have waited 1,700 years. You understand? So if it wasn't the United States that Christ was creating, because it came 1,700 years later, then what does that leave us with? Maybe the Roman government? No, the Roman government had already been made a long time ago. Okay, what else could it be? Israel? Israel had already been made, man. So what is it? What did Christ create in the first century? What did the apostles create? What was the government that Christians had? Oh, I know. It was church government, Charlie. You ever heard of bishops before? You ever heard of presbyters? You ever heard of deacons? We have the laity, we have the deacons, we have the presbyters, we have the bishops. And above the bishops, who do we have? We have the Christ, who is the king. Of what kingdom? A kingdom on earth? No, not a kingdom on earth. The kingdom of heaven. We do have a government. We do have a king. We do have laws. We do have an entry into our government. That's called baptism, by the way, but we'll talk about that more here later in the video. Let's go ahead and proceed.
2 words there. So the point being, Christ called us to be salt and light. We as Christians should change the environment that we come in contact with. That's what salt and light do. So why should we then not care about changing government to be more Christ-like?
Well, you're conflating changing government to be more Christ-like with what I was discussing was nationalistic endeavors, which is the inherent view that our nation is better than other.
So again, I mean, if you've watched the video, these things are already talked about, but I might as well go over them again. Charlie Kirk is making the exact same point that we covered, that Celsus made. Celsus, by the way, not Celsus the Christian, you have to understand. Celsus the pagan, okay? Celsus the critic of Christianity. Celsus, the guy who is only remembered because he wrote a book making fun of Christianity. And that's the viewpoint that he expressed. It wasn't the viewpoint that Christians had. No, Christians responded to Celsus' arguments, his big book, and they address what he says about this. We see here how the so-called self-acclaimed Christians of the American right are embracing the talking points of a man who hated Christianity, Celsus the pagan from the 2nd century. And, you know, Charlie Kirk probably wouldn't care about that. He'd be like, who's Celsus? I don't understand this argument. I don't like the idea of just throwing something out at somebody and saying, don't you know that so-and-so said that? And they have no idea who you're talking about. But my point here is that if you are a self-acclaimed Christian, you should probably be a little bit worried. It should be a pause for concern if your only representation in antiquity is the people who hate Christianity and are actively fighting against it from spreading. But no, from the words that issue forth from their mouth, we see the substance, the content of the inner soul that they possess. And it is not a Christian soul. It is not a soul that is aligned with Christ and has the mind of Christ, that has adopted the spirit of Christ, but it is instead a worldly soul whose knee-jerk reaction is the exact same mindset that was expressed by the people who hated Christianity. Origen of Alexandria records Celsus saying in his great refutation of Celsus, Celsus urges Christians to take office in the government of the country if that is required for the maintenance of the laws and the support of religion.
We as Christians should change the environment that we come in contact with. That's what salt and light do. So why should we then...
Celsus's point in his original writing was that if Christians are concerned with advancing their beliefs and making sure that their beliefs are represented in society, they should take political office so that they can change laws to adapt, so that they can mold the laws in accordance with what they believe to be righteous. This is exactly what Charlie Kirk is saying. And Charlie is basically saying that the only way that you can be a light, the only way that you can be salt, is if you get involved in political office. Christ never got involved in political office, though. When they came to make him king, he ran away. And the early Christians also avoided political office. They did not do that kind of thing. They were not involved in politics. Tertullian says that there's nothing more entirely foreign to us than the affairs of state as Christians. So what then? Are we to believe what Charlie says and think that there's nothing that we can do as Christians aside from voting to change the world? There's nothing that we can do of voting blue. If we don't vote blue, if we don't vote red, then we have no possibility, no opportunity to affect change in the world. What are you, retarded? You putz, you dummy, you. We, of course, can change the world. Several people have changed the world without getting involved in political office, without voting. Give me a break. The early Christians were extremely influential with anybody that they ever knew and also on their society, and they did that without taking political office. All the most notable and esteemed, highly beloved, celebrated early Christian figures were not in political office. They were in church government. Yeah, you could say they were in church government, but church government doesn't have anything to do with political office, you must understand. As Origen says, those who are ambitious to rule in a worldly way, in a worldly power, in the actual human government, we reject those people, Origen says, but we constrain those who, through excess of modesty, are not easily induced to taking a public charge in the church of God, and those who rule over us, well, are under the constraining influence of the great King, whom we believe to be the Son of God, God the Word, the Logos. And if those who govern in the church and are called rulers of the divine nation, that is, the church, rule well, they rule in accordance with divine commands, and never suffer themselves to be led astray by worldly policy. Origen says that it's not for the purpose of trying to escape public duties that Christians decline public offices, but that they may reserve themselves for a diviner and more necessary service in the Church of God. And the Church of God is a nation. It's a divine nation. As Mathete says, which is the name that we know him by, in his letter to Diognetus, he says the same thing. He says that Christians endure all things as if they were foreigners. Every foreign land to them is as their native country, and every land of their birth is a land of strangers. Their own homeland is completely foreign to them. He says they pass their days on the earth, but in truth, they are really citizens of heaven, the kingdom of heaven.
Borders is biblical. The entire book of Nehemiah is about building a wall around the nation of Israel. In fact, the idea of borders, the idea of sovereignty, is an explicitly biblical idea.
Yes, but Israel is no longer defined by the physical borders. It's actually defined in the spiritual sons and daughters of God who believe in Jesus.
That's a Catholic interpretation.
That's not just Catholic.
Again, it's primarily a Catholic interpretation. I don't share it. I don't want to get into that theological debate.
Okay.
Because
This young man, Nick, is completely correct here. This is not a Catholic idea. This is not any kind of Orthodox idea. It's not that they invented it. You know, typically, if you're ever saying that an idea belongs to a certain someone or a group of people, that's typically, oftentimes, because that group of people or that person created that idea. The Catholics did not create that idea. You must understand, it was the early Christians that believed that. All early Christians, not just, the earliest Christians we're talking here. And Christ himself taught us this, and the apostles taught us this. And I talk about that in the actual edited video, so I'm not going to drag that out here, but that's a fact. All of the early Christians believed that the Christians are the spiritual Israel. And yeah, Charlie Kirk is completely correct here. A nation is defined by its borders, among, a couple different things, but borders is one of the key things. But this is under a worldly understanding. This is under worldly thought. Maybe natural law, you could say. I could appreciate what Charlie is saying from a standpoint of natural law. That makes complete sense. I completely understand why a government would want to protect its borders, its language, its culture. That is what makes it unique. That is what it's seeking to preserve. Obviously, it would want to preserve that. It would want to preserve its borders especially. I completely understand that. However, Christians have a very different viewpoint, you must understand, from the way worldly people think. And is it because we're cuckoo? Well, maybe some people may say so, but it's because we view things in a completely different way than people who are operating under natural law believe. We Christians see things, we view things in a very timeless sort of sense. Everything that we believe oftentimes has to do with the full picture. It's from a big picture kind of perspective. A person who has no faith in a resurrection or a judgment day is going to act very differently, you would expect, if they truly believe it, from a person that does believe in a resurrection and a judgment day. But I digress. My only point in bringing that up was to establish the idea that Christians do have a very different perspective because of the things that we believe about the world. Anybody can be a Christian if they want to. It doesn't matter what nationality they belong to. Person could be living in France, another person could be living in North Africa, another person could be living in Italy, so on and so forth. They could all be Christians and have camaraderie, and they're a part of the same kingdom at the fundamental core. To a Christian viewpoint, there are no borders, because when all is said and done, we're going to inherit this earth. We're not going to have borders. Maybe we'll have borders with you evil people. You'll be over in Gehenna, right? That'll be the border between Gehenna and where we are. That'll be the border, I guess. But but as of right now, there's no border amongst Christians. We live in the earth. We are dispersed among several different countries, but our true allegiance is to the kingdom of heaven. That being said, there is a spiritual border, I would say, and that spiritual border is the vetting of people, only allowing worthy people to join the faith or remain in the faith. People who don't want to become Christians, they don't become Christians, or people who are not truly committed, who have not weighed out the costs and in a mature way made that decision for themselves that they want to commit to being a Christian and living by the commands which Christ has given to humanity. These people will not be admitted into the Christian faith. And likewise, people who have been admitted into the Christian faith, we will deport spiritually via excommunication. Now, with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and skip a little bit later into the video here because they go off into the weeds big time. They're no longer discussing early Christianity or anything like that, not even necessarily Christian belief anymore, but stuff going on in previous American history.
And the church doesn't need to have government in order to thrive. In fact, in suffering and humility, the church thrives.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's like totally insane, but that's fine.
How is that insane? Go look at the early church.
You want to invite persecution.
Yeah, and see, Nick, again, is completely correct here. The church has always done better under persecution. The first 300 years of the early church, and in those periods where the persecution was its most intense, resulted in the most zealous, pious, devoted Christians. Charlie calls Nick's viewpoint insane, but that's because Charlie is a schmuck. Charlie doesn't know history. If Charlie knew history, he would know that during the early church, it's the famous saying. Even Protestants know this saying, by the way. They don't know who said it, but they know that somebody said it. They said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The blood of the martyrs. Those first 3 centuries where Christianity was being the most persecuted was the most purifying time and produced the best saints in church history. And if you're logical, you understand, if it's really dangerous to become a Christian, maybe, just more than likely, it's still possible that you could have some bad actors, but more than likely, the majority of people who are going to want to become Christians are actually going to be committed to Christianity because, honestly, there's not a lot that you're going to get out of this. Like, bishops in the first 300 years didn't have any fancy clothes. They had, no money. They were basically living just the most impoverished life. Some of these guys didn't even own shoes. Some of these guys only owned 1 pair of clothes, okay? They didn't even own a bed to sleep on. They slept on the floor. So being a Christian was not this luxurious thing. Only the people that were truly committed typically would think about becoming Christians because it was such a high-stakes thing. But as soon as the government becomes your buddy, the government buddies up with the church, well, suddenly we see military leaders, various political rulers wanting to go and join the church. Now it's a whole big thing. The emperor likes it. There's a lot of power to be gained from this, a lot of political power. You get close to the emperor, a lot of wealth, and everything else that comes with that, all the sins. No, we see a complete corruption of the clergy with getting involved. No, we see a complete corruption of the priesthood getting involved with the government.
Inviting it, but yes, Christians ought to welcome it and embrace it and go through it.
Okay, but sometimes persecution results in the unjust suffering of millions of people unnecessarily. And so you should never invite evil into this world.
Did Jesus not promise that to us?
And here again, I mean, we're talking about a very carnal, worldly mind on display that we're seeing here from Charlie Kirk. Very worldly, not a Christian mindset, by the way. This is how worldly people who don't believe in a resurrection or in a judgment day, this is how these sorts of people react to hearing these ideas that Christians have, these beliefs that Christians have. They make appeals to the suffering of people. Christ suffered quite a bit, Charlie, and as Nick has aptly pointed out here, he promised a lot of suffering to his followers, and there is a great reward for that. Now, yes, the early Christians say that we should flee suffering, that we should flee, being attacked and being persecuted, obviously. But that being said, the best times in the church were under the most severe persecution, as we have already stated. And we are not seeing long-term Christian thinking on display here. After all is said and done, after the resurrection, let's say, according to our current understanding of time, according to human time, after the resurrection, everything everything has changed. We're in the next age now. The resurrection has happened. And at this point, we're like, 7 million years after everything has happened, after Judgment Day, after the resurrection and everything. After all that has occurred, we're 7 million years now in the future after having been resurrected. Do you think anybody's going to freaking care about having died 7 million years ago? Suffering pain for what? A few minutes, a few hours, a couple days, months, years even? Origen suffered for years. Do you think he regretted it? Do you think he was making these kind of emotional arguments? No, he was forward thinking. He looked forward to the resurrection. He knew that there would be a great reward. But no Christian makes this kind of argument about the suffering. If anything, the only argument that a Christian would make is about how persecution is bad for the people who are inflicting the persecution, because they're damning themselves by killing pious people.
You have a dangerously surface level.
You should read early church fathers on how they view violence and
actually,
the military.
So you want to talk about early church fathers? Tell me about St. Augustine's just war theory.
You tell me about it.
Tell me. You just brought up early church fathers.
No, you tell me about
Tell
it.
me about St. Augustine in the City of God, 3rd chapter, just war theory.
Well, I don't really...
Oh, Augustine, the most illustrious early church father, of course. We love Disgustin. When was Disgustin, by the way? Disgustin of Hippo. He was in the 400s, late 300s, early 400s. Very early, of course. You realize, Charlie, you putz, Augustine is further removed in time from Christ than we are from George Washington. Augustine was a very foolish and reckless man who introduced a lot of novelties in the church and willingly contradicted the people who came before him. No, if we want to talk about early Christians, we've been talking about them the whole time. And I talk about them at great length in the big edited video that I made, and brought up the very earliest Christian testimony that we have about this subject.
A lot of St. Augustine, because
he's the most popular early church
West,
father.
in the West. But there's the East, St. Athanasius, St. Gregory of Nyssa, Origen, all these different names that you probably...
He's the most popular early church father.
In the West. But there's the East, St. Athanasius, St. Gregory of Nyssa, Origen, all these different names that you probably are not familiar with because it's in the East. But most early church fathers condemned violence for, if you're in the church, you must leave the military.
Now, Nick here tries to make the argument to Charlie Kirk that, okay, well, Augustine is over there in the West. What about the Eastern Fathers, though? You should look into the Eastern Fathers. We should not make this necessarily just a matter of geography. Geography is not the only key thing. It's geography and time, chronology. We want early and we want around the world, okay? That's what we want. We want to see the geography. We want to see it on the map. We want to see it spread across the Roman Empire. But we also want to see the early. We want to see it early and all over the place. Nick here should have made more of an emphasis on chronology, that Augustine is actually not the most popular church father. Maybe to a moron he's the most popular church father. Maybe to a dunce, the most uneducated person, he's the most popular church father. But Nick rightly brings up, in some of the names that he drops, he rightly brings up Origen, who is an Eastern church father. But not only is he Eastern, he is well before Augustine. And not only, this is where Nick could have done a little bit better if he had been just a little bit more informed, or if he was informed, I don't blame him. He probably couldn't think on his feet. You're in this situation here, there's this big crowd around you. I get it, you might freeze on some things. But with that being said, it's not just about East versus West. We don't want to make this some kind of weird thing where like, well, I'm representing the Eastern belief and you're representing the Western belief. No, the true Christians want to represent the earliest Christian universal, as in Catholic belief. Catholic being, again, universal. Small c. And if you look on this map that I have here, which I used in the big edited video that I did, we have 3 points of location. And this big circle, the purpose of this big red circle that you see here, is to show you where Christianity had pretty much spread within the first 300 years. This was its reign of influence, its major reign of influence, okay? This is the central location of Christianity where it's most prominent. And what do we see? Not only over here on the east in Alexandria, if you see there on the right, where Origen was, okay? But we also see Western. We see Rome, which was Hippolytus, and Carthage, which was North Africa, Tertullian. And Tertullian and Hippolytus, who also, like Origen, predate Augustine, they are Western fathers. Hippolytus is a Western father. Tertullian is a Western father. And so we see both East and West united on this belief. And if you see here, this is covering significant basis within this circle. We're not just seeing it on one specific weird location where they had some weird ideas, but we see this spread out here. We do see within the circle, it's spread out, this belief. And so that's really, as Christians, what we want to be concerned with. We want to be concerned not only with universal belief, but also ancient universal belief. It's the fact that it is ancient, the first testimony that we have on this thing. Charlie Kirk wants to bring up Disgustin of Hippo, who came along in the late 300s, early 400s, who contradict everybody before him. You know, I asked Charlie, do you want to understand the Constitution of the United States correctly? Are you going to go to somebody that came along way after the fact? Or do you want to go earlier and earlier, the earliest that you can possibly get, the earliest testimony that you can get, to, reasonably get as close of an understanding as you can to the original intention of the author, the authors in this case, of the Constitution? And obviously conservatives understand this anytime we're talking about the Founding Fathers, but they should really apply this same method of reasoning to the Church Fathers.
I
War
just
on
want
people
to
and
be
killing millions
clear
of people.
that Christians should not serve in the military is your contention?
That's my belief. You don't have to believe that.
Yeah. We're going to have to get to the next question.
All right.
That's a new one. I got to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you.
He says, that's a new one, but it's new to Charlie Kirk, you have to understand. It's new to you. Just because something is new to you doesn't mean that within all of human history that it's new. In fact, what's new to you may be the original teaching. It may be the oldest teaching, because it's the original. The original is the oldest. As I've said many times in other videos, we should be skeptical about things that are new. However, we should investigate whether that is merely new to us or if it is new to the church. If it is in fact the most ancient and oldest teaching in the church, then we ought to get over that silly idea that we have that this is new and strange to us, and we ought to embrace and cleave to antiquity.